I'll call David Shearer.
As Gareth Hughes said earlier on, I think we're having an extremely good discussion on this, which is perhaps a sort of slightly higher plane than most of the legislation that often comes through to the House. This clause 7 really looks at the three words in particular that run right through the various parts of the clause, which is science, technology, and humanities. And Pete Hodgson, I think, touched on and answered the questions of some of the other members when they asked, "What about research?" We've just had a Ministry of Research, Science and Technology, and we had a Foundation for Research and Science and Technology, and now we have a Ministry for Science and Innovation. The word research has actually been removed from the title of those ministries, and as Pete Hodgson quite rightly argued, it's been taken out because research is an inherent part of science. You cannot have science unless you have research, and we can discuss the type of scientific research on which you could have, but nevertheless, research is part of that. The really interesting point is that humanities have been brought into those three words. And I want to make just a couple of points. And first, again, I'd like to go back to what Pete Hodgson was talking about in terms of the Marsden Fund, because in some ways the Marsden Fund, which is to recognise and reward excellence in New Zealand, has for some time been provided awards in both the science and the humanities area. And there has been no problem along those lines in terms of that happening. And in many ways what we are trying to do with this piece of legislation is to ensure, is to bring the humanities into the Royal Society. The Marsden Fund, and he mentioned this in his contribution, is for excellence. And regardless of what end it might be put forward for in the future, regardless in a sense of what it might be able to produce, it is about the best research that we could possibly do. And we can have extreme examples of these, but it is something which is held up as being the best research, the best science in New Zealand. My only issue with the Marsden Fund, and I just diverge onto this just for a short period of time, Mr. Chair, is that often work is done, it's already, in a sense, we already have the conclusions before we can actually put the application forward for the Marsden Fund. And so in a sense the 2 years funding for the Marsden Fund is many ways confirming what we've already found out. And so in a sense the Marsden Fund does not do exactly what we would like it to do, to take forward an area of science at the most excellent level. At many times, to get the Marsden Fund, you must actually already know almost the conclusions of your research. The other thing that I want to just point out, Mr. Chair, about that is that it is only 5% of the applications that actually get rewarded in this regard. And just about everybody that I've spoken to said, well, it could easily be 10%. Making that cut-off point between 5 and 10 and even 15 is extraordinarily difficult. And wouldn't it be great in New Zealand that if we actually had more money to be able to provide that extra 5 or 10% to those other researchers who are there, who are just as excellent, but perhaps for whatever reason have not been chosen. But I come back to the key point on this that I started with. The key point is that humanities has been part of the Marsden Fund, which has been seen as the highest point of endeavour in our scientific community amongst the universities and CRIs, etc. And in doing that, there has been no problem about dumbing down science or making science less relevant, but in fact holding humanities and science up together. So a very important point, Mr. Chair. The other thing that I wanted to say is that the submissions, Mr. Chair.
David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The submissions that were made to this bill on the humanities, I think there were about 13, and I don't have the exact figure. I think 9 out of that 13, maybe 10 out of that 13, were against bringing humanities into the Royal Society. And it seemed to me, Mr. Chair, that in fact what many of those branches believed and felt was that by bringing the humanities in, it would undermine the tenets of the Royal Society and what the Royal Society stood for, i.e. excellence in science. In fact, I actually think what's going to happen, it was actually the other way around the more I look at this. It was in fact just the humanities that need to worry about it, about what was going to happen by bringing the humanities into an august scientific organisation like the Royal Society. And it's the humanities that are going to have to, in a sense, not fight, but it could, in a sense, perhaps face the greatest risk of being submerged by broader science within the society. So I think that the movement forward is a healthy one on both sides, both the pure scientists and those who are involved in the humanities. And the humanities, again, as Pete Hodgson pointed out to my colleague, Dr. Roger Prasad, involves many of those social sciences as well, are going to have to work together for the benefit of excellence and for the benefit of New Zealand. And no one side will be, in a sense, threatened, as many of the submissions seem to suggest when they came before the select committee. So, Mr. Chair, the movement forward, and has been pointed out, of bringing humanities in, looking at science, technology and humanities, covers that broad range of endeavour that we believe belong together, and in a much more, as other speakers have said, in this much more complex world where we're looking at global warming or some of the other areas of that where we're trying to apply science to, there's a natural fit. They naturally fit together, and we need to have that broad conversation across the breadth of the Royal Society. I just want to make one comment about something that Gareth Hughes mentioned before about the Royal Society and why it's called the Royal Society, and he mentioned the fact that he was an avid Republican, as am I, Mr. Hughes. There's an element of the Royal Society is a traditional thing. It's 1867 when this was first put forward. It was first established, and therefore, of course, royal in those years had a much more relevant connotation than it does today. But I still believe that we can be cognizant and respectful of the history of this organisation by maintaining its title. The Royal. I'd hate to see it be called the Republican Society of Science. I mean, I don't think that quite has the same ring to it as the Royal Society. And so, therefore, Mr. Chair, I believe that the Royal Society and what it stands for, and in particular where it's going, which is about what Clause 7 is really establishes in the 6 parts that are part of Clause 7, which is to bring in the issue of humanities into the Royal Society. And I want to particularly point out in the Part E of that clause to provide, and I'll read it out, to provide expert advice on important public issues to the government and the community. Now, that can involve pure science, but by definition of what it is anticipating doing, it must bring in the society and the way that society works as well. And that means to incorporate what we've been talking about, which is bringing in humanities. So in conclusion, Mr. Chair, I believe that the Royal Society is going in the right track, taking the right track in bringing in the humanities. I think that those 3 words which pervade the Clause 7 of this piece of legislation, science, technology, humanities, sir, are reflective of where we would want to see the Royal Society going forward in the future. Thank you.